the Assistant Supervisor of Exhibitions here at Brand. Shannon Curry-Holmes is the Exhibition Supervisor, and I am the Curator of Valley Girl Redefined. That is I hope you all had a few minutes to check out the show, and if you haven't yet, please do afterwards. I'd like to introduce Anna, who will talk about our panel, and thank you again for coming. Please stay after the panel for refreshments. There's water, coffee, and some snacks outside. Thank you.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for coming. I'm Anna, the publisher of Artillery. We want to first off give a huge thank you to the brand. Shannon and Aaron, they did a lot of this, so this panel is called Is Anything Off Limits? Actually, that incredible show that Aaron curated has been reviewed by both Artillery and the New Yorker, so you must see it, and there's a lot of topics about censorship that will be covered. So I'm going to very quickly introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to let Stephen, the moderator, take over. So we have Stephen Goldberg, of course, who is our art brief columnist. Every issue of Artillery, there is a column about art and law, and that is by Stephen Goldberg. We have a writer, an Artillery writer and artist, Leanna Robinson. We have Casey Kaufman, who is one of the artists that is currently in the show. Yes. That's my God. And William Moreno, who is an art advisor and sometimes curator, correct?
Ex-museum director. So
yes,
talk about
ex-museum
that.
director. And then make sure to say hello to Tulsa Kinney. Where is Tulsa?
Right here.
Oh, hi Tulsa. That's the editor-in-chief and founder of Artillery. And make sure to take an issue of the magazine home. This just came out this week, this past week. It's the women's issue. Happy belated International Women's Day. And I'm going to let Stephen now take over. Thank you again for coming.
Oh, that's dangerous. All right, so who am I? I'm an art lawyer. There are a few of us in America, and that's not the only thing I do, but I do specialize in that to a certain extent. So I represent artists, art galleries, art collectors, art advisors, sometimes foundations, that kind of thing. We're talking about art censorship tonight, and I've handled a few of these cases and know a little bit about it, so yeah, I'm not the world expert on it, but I know enough to get us through here, hopefully. So I'm just going to introduce the panel here. William Moreno is an independent consultant, writer, curator, and art advisor. He was founding executive director of, can you all hear me, by the way?
Yeah, can you hear
Okay.
back there? The microphones just need to be turned on if you want to, if anyone's having trouble hearing or, yeah? I think they just need to be turned on.
I'm gonna mess it up. No, it's okay. They just,
Hello.
there we go.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Hello.
There you go. So you can either, it will just amplify just by
Okay.
being closer.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so William was founding, start again. It's William Moreno. He's an independent consultant, writer, curator, and art advisor. He was founding executive director of the Claremont Museum of Art in Claremont. He was executive director of the Mexican Museum in San Francisco, responsible for all aspects of the museum's operation, permanent collection acquisitions, programs, and capital fundraising. Prior to his museum position, he was the director of a commercial fine art gallery located in Silicon Valley, focused on contemporary art and photography. He also served as board chair of LACE and currently serves on the advisory board of the California Association of Museums. Now I'm going to move on to Casey Kaufman. and she was born in the Valley, and she's in the show Valley Girl Redefined, which is currently up right here at the Brand. She's a multidisciplinary artist whose work is an investigation of relationships, fascination to disgust, internal to external narrative, and non-objective to physical practices. Her current work consists of drawings, iPhone collages, social media performance and installations. By filtering the representations of women, predominantly authored by men, through her own perspective, she translates and amends her uncomfortable relationship to these images. Her seemingly superficial drawings and collages soften the personal blow of personal truth and pain present in her work. She aims to glorify honest, unapologetic expressions of grief, anger, sexuality, subversive humor, and shameless validation seeking. All of the above. And you should see her work out there. It's really something else. Kaufman received a BA in studio art from Evergreen State College, and she's been in quite a few shows in LA. I'm not going to mention all of them. Okay. So the young lady sitting next to me, Leanna Robinson, is an artist and writer living in LA. She's from Florida, earned a BA in creative writing from UCF. She's the assistant editor of Language Magazine. She writes for Artillery Magazine and has edited works for Muck Books, Death Bomb Arc, and the Florida Review. She's been published in, as I said, Artillery, Hyperallergic, The Rooster, and Orlando Weekly. And that's our panel for tonight. So I've been writing a number of columns on art censorship. In fact, you have the magazine, there's one in the current issue about the show that was censored at the Guggenheim in New York. I titled it Theater of the Absurd. And it dealt with that show, which I saw up at SF MoMA. The title work in the show, which is depicted in the, it's on page 18, the title work in the show is called Theater of the World, and it was censored. There's an empty terrarium there, and in fact 2 of them, which were handmade and left at the entrance to the show, despite the fact that the reason for being there was the fact that they had live insects and reptiles inside of them. And according to animal rights people, that was just too much. So the Guggenheim, after some very serious threats, decided not to have the live animals in there. And my take on it was that the whole thing was now absurd, because you're censoring the name piece for the show, and and it went downhill from there because there are 2 other works that were censored. So we'll get back to that. But prior to that, I wrote another piece about, it was kind of a roundup of last year. There were a number of serious censorship issues with museums, and I'm going to get to that. But first I wanted to start with this book, which is Degenerate Art, which unfortunately is out of print for a very long time, because it was the catalog for LACMA's landmark show by the legendary curator Stephanie Barron, who rediscovered for the world the Nazis' war on modern art. By the fall of 1937, they had stripped 16,000 avant-garde works from the nation's museums and sent 650 to Munich for a massive exhibition, degenerate art as they called it. Among the artists who were censored and their work seized were Max Beckmann, Marc Chagall, Otto Dix, George Gross, Wassily Kandinsky, Paul Klee, Oskar Kukushka, Kirchner, Franz Marc, Emil Nolde, and Karl Rudloff. Eventually, 3 million visitors are estimated to have seen the show during its 4-year tour of Germany and Austria. Now, it's often forgotten that the show toured the entire country of Germany and Austria, because usually, and the photos in here are from the show in Munich. And the same year, across 1937, across the street, they had their show of approved art, which was completely banal and ridiculous artwork, but the crowds, at something like 3 or 4 to 1, wanted to see the degenerate art. So it's interesting, 1937, there had been already book burnings, and after this, there was a crackdown, or simultaneously with the art attack on art, was an attack on music, in which they censored music, everybody, including Mahler and so forth, all modern music, Stravinsky and so on and so forth. So the point is, it's a slippery slope, and you say, well, it can't happen here, but it can happen here. And an example of that is the fact that Rudy Giuliani, who some of you may have heard of, he claims to be the president's lawyer, although he's probably his television lawyer, more accurately, instead of his personal lawyer. In any event, he had a huge controversy in 1990, in the late 1990s, over Chris O'Feely's The Holy Virgin Mary. The piece was a black Virgin Mary with exaggerated features surrounded by butterfly-like images of women's butts cut from porn magazines. Shimmering yellow, gold, and blue, the piece rested on 2 spears of elephant dung. Another adorned her breast. And so the mayor lost it and basically said, it was blasphemous, it offended all Catholics, and the show at the Brooklyn Museum, of which it was a part of, he attempted to cut off public funding to the museum, and in fact tried to evict the museum from the premises of the building. They countersued, and eventually he gave up on it. But the chief supporter of Mayor Giuliani, for those who might remember, was Donald Trump. And Trump, in fact, labeled it degenerate. And the interesting thing about Trump is, no matter what you might think of him or his intellect, he does choose words in a very conscious way. And I don't think that was a mistake on his part by any means, or just an accident. So, I'm not saying it's going to happen, it most likely won't, but, those things could occur. So anyway, my article last May, I'm just going to briefly go down the 4 major incidents. The first one was an online petition in which Baltus, one of the great artists of the 20th century, master artist, and you have this in, I think you'll have this in your handout there. It should be the first article. The painting in question was the preteen or teen Teresa, who was a neighbor's child. And he painted her and her brother about 11 times. And I've seen it, I think I saw it at least half a dozen times at the Met. She's dreaming. There's also the cat, which is another figure that Baltus was obsessed with. Yeah, the online petition said that it was exploitive of young women and so forth. But, you know, Baltus, this is a dreamlike state that she's in, and Baltus was associated with the Surrealists. And much of his work, on the second page, is the street, which is a fixture of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. The street is a fascinating painting. I probably first saw it when I was about 6 years old. And anytime I've been there and they've had it hanging up, I've certainly seen it. It's one of the key works of the 20th century, without question. Another key work, The Mountain by Baltus, is at the Met, along with this painting and I think another one that's similar to this one of Teresa. So anyway, there was an online petition, 500,000 signatures to take it down, and basically the Met told them to take a hike. Then there's, if you turn to page 6 of my article there's some gallows, and it was a depiction by Sam Durant, a local artist, who has a national and international reputation. He did these execution tableaus. You seem to be fascinated by that. He did John Brown. And this one was the recreation of a horrific structure that was used to execute 38 members of the Dakota tribe by the U.S. military in the 19th century. It's thought to be the largest mass execution in history, in the U.S. history. The thing is, it was constructed on the grounds of the Walker in Minnesota, and it was on sacred Dakota land, the tribe, the Dakota tribe. So there was a lot of controversy about that. Durant had smoked a peace pipe with the Native Americans, and decided the better thing to do was to destroy the work. And so he self-censored, censored his own work. The last one I want to point out was perhaps the most contentious of all, and that was the Whitney Biennial, the last Whitney Biennial. I believe one's coming up right away. And this was Dana Schutz, the artist, Open Casket, 2016. It's a depiction of Emmett Till. That name might sound familiar from the Civil Rights Movement. Till was lynched in 1955 in Mississippi after a white woman claimed he whistled and leered at her. He was also tortured and beaten, and the depiction's on page 7 of her work, Open Casket. From a photograph. It created quite a disturbance. An African-American artist conducted a vigil standing in front of the work to block the view of it. The Whitney said that the show focused on racial, economic, and cultural violence and refused to take it down. But the artist, Dana Schutz, said that she would never sell it. In May, I don't know whether, I think it might have been at Christie's, but it might have been at Sotheby's. In the May auctions in New York, her work set a record for her of $2.2 million. So, we'll take it from there.
Can I make a comment
Yeah.
about the Durant piece?
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that happens, or that's important for institutions to consider is, what's the curatorial imperative here, and how do we communicate this to the public at large? To me, those examples are failures, institutional failures, more than anything else. Clarity of curatorial purpose, the fact that, in my view, the Walker was not prepared for the blowback, and the reason that director lost her job was she handled it poorly, and that became a rupture in the community. So, the end to the director. And the final part of this is, when you're running an institution like that, I think you need to have in place all the staff and the public relations and the narrative that the institution wants to communicate to the public. And if one of those things is missing, what happens is this sort of snowball effect, that everybody's telling a different story, a different narrative, and it gets blown out of proportion. And having worked with the press many times, I've learned that one needs to control that narrative, which admittedly Trump is brilliant at. But I think that there is a responsibility by the institution to make sure that if they're going to put something out there, that they respond responsibly to that piece. And again, some of those examples to me are institutional failures.
Well, I think you're absolutely right about the Walker. Because they clearly must have known that it was on Dakota land. And
Well, I think not. I think they were somewhat
that's
clueless.
shocking.
Yeah.
What about the responsibility of the artist, though? I kind of feel like if you're making work that's supposed to serve a marginalized community, and then that community comes out and says, this work doesn't serve our community, I kind of feel like Sam Durant's response is the best thing an artist could do. What responsibility do these curators have to the communities that they say that they serve? What responsibilities do these artists have? Dana Schutz makes a painting, that's supposed to empathize with a particular community. And then when that community responds and says this doesn't serve our purposes, how does an artist properly respond?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's tied. I think that's tied to the institutional and curatorial narrative as
Right.
well. They need to be really closely aligned, for sure.
I think that if artists are going to always make work that subverts social norms, we're going to be pushing boundaries, and these things are going to happen. And I think that the conversation should be less about whether a painting should be burned or taken out of light. I think the question is really, what do we do after these things happen? How do we actually engage with communities rather than making them continually feel inferior when they visit these institutions that often don't represent them, don't serve them.
Well, the brand is doing it, right?
Yeah.
So here's a great example
Right.
of, I read in the exhibit some of the disclaimers, et cetera, which I think they're kind of tiny, but that's okay. They're there. As I talk to staff, everybody's ready. They have an answer. It's not, well, I'm not sure, or, I don't know, talk to the artist. There's a lot of clarity there, and I think that's certainly critical to this.
Well,
Yeah.
I think too, something to point out is, I feel like before there's censorship, there has to be acknowledgement of curatorial responsibility. The curatorial staff, for instance, at the Whitney, maybe should have made a wiser decision to show her painting, because then you wouldn't even be having the discussion, do we take it down? I think that the more important question is, do we put it up? What do we put up? What should we have, works with live animals? Are these actually things that we should be putting up? And if you choose to do that, like you're saying, then you should be willing and ready for blowback, because I think a lot of it too comes down to there's not very much curatorial diversity. There is some, of course, but I think that right now, especially for instance with like Decolonize the Brooklyn Museum, you have people rallying for a more diverse curatorial staff, and with more diverse curatorial staff, I feel like a lot of these things won't even happen. You know, if the curatorial staff, for instance, for who is funding Sam Durant, like maybe if he had spoken with someone who was Dakota
Right.
before even in making his work, then I think that you wouldn't have to even have the question of censorship after the fact.
And it wasn't the kind of work that was salacious. I mean, it wasn't sexually motivated, there was no nudity. It was all about place and spirit. And, you know, Native Americans, rightfully so, take that really seriously. I mean, what I've noticed, I did a show when I was in San Francisco. I was the chair of a small organization in the Mission, of all places. And we did a show with, who did we do a show here? Let me look at my notes. I did a show with, let's see, Alex Donice. So if any of you know Alex Donice's work, he's the guy that did a series of prints with gang members dancing with police officers, et cetera, et cetera. So and his show was pulled from the Cultural Center in Silver Lake because of that. But we did a show way back. It was called My Cathedral. And, you know, Alex is influenced by notions of Baroque religiousness and the hypocrisy of the religious establishment. So it was a stained glass, sort of visible to the public installation. You could see right into the gallery, and the imagery that was on the walls were things like a Mother Teresa embracing Madonna, Fidel Castro and Kennedy embracing, Martin Luther King and the Klansmen embracing. That show, you know, it was up 2 days, and then we had windows destroyed, and there was violence in that community. And I think I was the board chair at that point. I was scared shitless about this whole thing. But what we did is we immediately did a community meeting, and that helped mitigate sort of the blowback over time. But we were prepared for it. We didn't expect that level of, I guess, violence against this. But when you talk about religion or iconic figures, you know, you throw yourself out there to the public, and anything can happen. So,
well, you know, art often has to be, by definition, has to disturb in order to be significant in certain ways. So, you know, it's going to come up all the time, but you know, we have something called the First Amendment. So, yeah, I'm gonna get into that a little bit, because there's yeah, we can. What I like to do is I'd like to use right now. I'd like to use Casey's.
Before we do that,
yeah.
can I just say one more thing
Sure.
about some of the examples that you gave? I'm so sorry, but I kind of take issue with the idea of comparing these actions by Nazi governments and the degenerate art story and Rudy Giuliani. You know, those are governmental bodies taking action over the representation of these artists. But in the case of the Danish Schutz, or in the case of, you know, the Sam Durant or these Chinese artists, these are marginalized communities. These are activists. I think that's very different than a governmental body taking action against artists. And I think that, you know, if we do want everyone to feel welcome in museums, we should be welcoming dissent. I don't think that these are attacks on freedom of speech. I think that more than anything, these are opportunities for us to better serve communities.
Well, there's a thin line, and,
Yeah.
you know, ultimately, it's when the government's involved where it really gets dicey.
Certainly, but the protesters to Danish Schutz, you know, I don't think
Yeah,
that really
they're-
compares.
There are, yeah, I mean, there are differences, and
Yeah.
and in terms of the Chinese dissident art show, yeah, it was animal rights
Right.
people who, yeah, and then some crazy people who went amok and made bomb threats and so forth. But I do want to,
Sure, yeah. I just had to
since
say
it's
that.
the elephant in the room, so
Yeah.
to speak, in the next room there.
Mhm.
So what I want to do is I want you to, tell us, you don't have to go through every last
Sure.
detail, but just in general, how it went down, and then we
Absolutely.
can talk a little bit about that, because after all, this is, I believe, a publicly supported institution here.
Yes, yeah, it is a publicly funded library.
Right.
So I had made this piece. I've been working on an Instagram where I make digital collages. It's over 4 years, so there's 300 pieces, 300 collages. They're ordered chronologically, and 2 weeks before the show, I got an email from the curators here, and they told me that a few of the works were deemed, unfit for display in this space. And I'm, being a young artist, I'm no stranger to having to have my dukes up and fight for myself, and I was pretty angry when I found that out. And then I had some time to think about it, some time to talk to my faculty at school, to gather my thoughts, and I realized that this was actually an opportunity to discuss censorship. So my solution was, I'm not willing to remove any of these collages from my piece. I'm not willing to remove them and replace them with something else, because that is antithetical to the idea of a chronologically ordered piece. So it undercuts the meaning. I can't do that. So if you want to censor my work, you can go ahead and put black squares over those pieces. And I suggest you print more black squares, because in a piece like this, you're inviting comparison, you're inviting contrasting, and I don't know if you've looked at the piece, but there are some far more salacious images that actually weren't censored. So I was fully expecting, maybe my piece would be a pattern of abstract black squares by the end of this, which didn't actually happen. And I said, if it needs to be censored, that's how we're gonna do it. I want it to be very obvious that that's what's happened. And then I want a wall text that says that this was the choice of the Brand Library. And I think this is a really great example of curators and artists working together to actually serve communities. This is a publicly funded space. Children come through here. I think their parents, in a way, have a right to consent to allow their kids to see some of these images, though I don't find them to be that offensive. I don't even think these curators find them to be that offensive, but it's their job to serve this community. And it's my job as an artist to, adapt to that. So I think it was actually a really great example of us working together, and now we're here talking about it, which is better than not talking about it,
Right, and we have some of the images in the handout there. So I guess we have 3 out of the 4. So you're able to see them even though they're not public.
And they're
unveiled right now?
We've got them
Oh,
unveiled.
that's
so
so
that
cool.
When you, at the end, when you want to go through, you can see them. The squares have been removed.
Awesome, for your eyes only.
Thank you. So, what I would say about that, and look, I perfectly understand that you work things out with them.
Absolutely.
And, if it satisfied you, that's a good thing. And if, most of your work is intact. And there's a plaque there, and we'll talk about that too. But I would say, this is what, if you called me up as Mr. Art Lawyer or whatever, I would tell you that that you could do something because, it's a municipal government involvement. So we're talking about First Amendment. And the First Amendment basically says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. It's that simple. That means, not just speech, but also art and imagery. So the First Amendment cases go back, to the beginning of the Republic, and I'm certainly not, but going to go there. So in any event, there's a line of cases under the First Amendment. I'm just going to point out a few of them, and one of them is so we would basically tell we give them a brief. I'm not gonna read the brief, okay, but I may reference a few cases. But the point is, we would give them a letter of, a demand letter. And also, it's not just me. You can't afford a lawyer, and if lawyers aren't, I might take a case like this for nothing, next to nothing, once in a while. Or there's the ACLU, and they're very sensitive to our censorship, and I think they would have intervened here possibly. So there's case law Hopper versus City of Pasco, 2001, Ninth Circuit. The court noted that Pasco, by opening its display, this was the City of Pasco, its display space to expressive activity, evinced an intent to create a designated public forum. In such a forum, the court concluded the content-based removal of work would only be justifiable if there is a compelling state interest and narrowly drawn to achieve that end. So that's the highest level that you can draw on under constitutional law, compelling state interest. And once you reach that level, it's hard for the municipality to overcome it. There's other cases from 81, from 74, and then there's one against John Ashcroft, who was a Republican Attorney General versus Ashcroft versus ACLU, 2002. Anyway, there's a line of cases, and what would happen was after they got our letter or brief or whatever, they would give up. No, they would fight, and we'd try to get an injunction in court, or we'd work something out, involve the artist and so forth, or maybe it'd end up like it ended up with you. The other thing is, with regard to plaques on the wall, well, the Guggenheim put plaques on the wall in the Chinese Dissident Art Show, and so did SF MoMA. They just went right along with it, and they said it became part of the history of the work. My conclusion is the work speaks for itself, and there doesn't need to be a plaque, and it's not part of the history of the work. I think it's absurd. I think that now, I talked to the public affairs people at SF MoMA, and they told me that the threats at the Guggenheim were very serious and very personal, and so I totally understand where they're coming from. But the way they handled it, nonetheless, seems to me to be absurd. And they should not have put any plaques up whatsoever. So with regard to this, again, now, if the artist wants to have a plaque, and Casey, in her case, wanted to have a plaque, and she reached that agreement. But if you had a lawyer involved in it, there might not be a plaque there. The other thing, if you hired me, but anyway, the other thing is, they also, what they did was they had these video works that they disapproved of at the animal rights people, and one of them, and I think it's also in your handout there, were dogs on treadmills, pit bulls facing each other, and the treadmill was sped up, and that's how they trained them to fight, and there were observers there. It's very disturbing, there's no doubt about it, it's not great. So the museum turned that video off, and instead they had just something on the video that said dogs that cannot touch each other. So it's just a blank video screen with the title. And that was how they handled that. And they had an artist statement, and also, a plaque. again, I don't think that was the proper way to handle it, but, yeah, we're getting to the point where maybe we need to have metal detectors at art museums to alleviate some of these problems.
Well, you
But I
know,
wanna, yeah,
we live in a very different world from 15 years ago. People are somewhat on edge. I know I was involved with the Jewish Museum in San Francisco, the Liebskin project. And as it was being developed, the concern with that project was bombs. And how do we prevent people coming underneath the edifice and bombing the place? So I think this is all part of that, safety concerns, people wanting to make sure that when the public comes to a particular venue, that they are safe. And if you have threats, you have an obligation as an institution to mitigate that threat. Because I'm sure, as you know, as a lawyer, if you don't mitigate the threat, then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it doesn't get any better.
there's no question about it, yes, there's no question about it. I am very sympathetic, they wouldn't disclose to me the exact nature of the threats, but, yeah, I take their word for it that it was very serious.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
If we understand that if there's a threat of violence, we have to remove these works for the safety of people who visit the museum, I'm trying to understand what the issue might be with a plaque that expands the context of what has happened. It seems like that would be, the very baseline minimal response that a curator should and could have to that.
Yeah, the problem is that these institutions said it became a part of the history of the work. It actually said that on the plaque. And I don't agree with that from an objective point of view. If the artist wants that, is okay with that, then
But the
then
artist
that's
doesn't
fine.
exist in a vacuum, like the.
Well, of course, so
Right?
that's what I'm saying. If they want to have the plaque up, that's
Right.
fine. But if they don't, and, the museum wants to do that, I think it's a mistake. I think the artwork it denigrates the value of the art and the meaning of the art.
So maybe it shouldn't be up there in the first place. Is that,
The plaque,
no, the work.
the work.
So the curator made
That's my question, like why?
Right.
I mean,
why
what
are we
was
thinking,
what was
why is this
compelling,
valid?
that begs the question a little bit. You have to back up and say, well, what's the thought process to including this? Is it sensational? Does it have an educational purpose? Does it make a point about the narrative of the exhibition? So to me, I question the internal judgment that surrounded this, and not necessarily blame what is an after-the-fact occurrence, because it's already out there. It's too late. And what you're trying to do is sort of mitigate, or get your bucket and try to save the ship a little bit.
Well, if there's, the problem with that is you get into self-censorship and everybody's second-guessing everything. And before you know it, we have art that, just looks like a lake, a tree, and a house.
I don't know about that.
Yeah, I feel like that's a pretty extreme.
I mean,
I
response.
disagree with
What do
that.
you think?
I think that, talking about the censorship of the work, for instance, with the dogs who cannot touch each other piece, right? Talking about the plaque and the censorship almost feels like you're talking about a symptom of something, but not the actual thing. The actual thing is, why was this work deemed valid? Why did a curator choose to put this in an institution? Is this actually valid to be in an institution? And if so, why? Because clearly it wasn't actually valid because they took it out. I think that it still comes back more to curatorial responsibility. I think that is the actual issue, not the censorship of art.
Well, there was a third work in the Chinese show, which were pigs mating. That was a video. And people were watching them mate and making, laughing or whatever they were saying. And, that was deemed offensive as well. One of the problems is, these were works by significant Chinese artists. And they chose the works that they wanted to present, and the curators agreed. And there are cultural differences. I mean, the way animals are viewed in certain cultures are different than the way Americans view them. So, yeah, if you're showing Chinese art, and that's a subject of Chinese art, you know, what are you supposed to show? You know, what Rudy Giuliani wants us to see?
Yeah, but the fact of the matter is, we're not in China.
Yeah, but who's to make
But
these
still, you wanna
decisions?
Expose. I'm sorry, at some point, are you gonna
Yeah,
open to the
we're-
audience?
Yeah,
'Cause
we'll get there.
I know the audience have a lot of questions.
Yeah, we're getting there close. I
Okay.
think another 5 or 6 minutes.
Okay.
So, since we're moving along, so I wanted to ask Leanna, she's written extensively about women's issues. And so, especially from the point of view of women artists and some of the controversies that have come up with the Me Too movement and artists and so forth. So why don't you?
Yeah, okay, so, I mean, I guess I could jump off from the point of view of plaques, right? So, you mentioned in your article, actually, the painting, Therese Dreaming, yeah? So I mentioned that in my article too, which you can find in the back, on page, starting on page 7, is it 7? I think it's, anyways.
That's the website.
This way.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
this
okay.
way. So I think that with art censorship, it seems to be two kind of camps. There's the camp like, you know, the Emmett Till painting where something is deemed, society has said that this is a new work and it doesn't serve us. And then there's the revisitation to old work that society is now revisiting and re-looking at and saying, actually, I think this work no longer serves us. And so that, I think those are kind of two general categories we have in art censorship, calling it that. And my argument is that with this painting in particular, right, I think that 500,000 people have a valid voice. I think that, you know, I don't know if the objectification of children, the sexualization of children, childhood muses, I mean, look at the painting. I think that it's unquestionable that maybe this was fine for years, and now we can revisit these works and ask, do they still serve us? Are they still valid? And, you know, because we talked about this, then you have the slippery slope argument, you know, if we start revisiting these works, not only that maybe our, you know, sexual objectification of women and children, you also have to look at works by artists that have sexually objectified or abused women. For instance, Chuck Close, Pablo Picasso, right? So we have these major institutional artists that we can now look back and revisit their work and ask, is this valid? Should we take down all the Picassos, right? Crazy, I know. But, and so obviously we're not gonna take down all the Picassos, you know, like, I don't think that's gonna happen, honestly. But my argument is, kind of in jest, like, if we did, we'd have a vacuum. And what can we put in there? You know, maybe there's other, golly, like female artists that we could put in those empty spaces. I know that's not gonna happen, but that's just what I'm saying. The less extreme thing is the plaque, right? So I think that maybe if we're not gonna create that vacuum to put new works by equally valid artists, because Picasso wasn't the only valid artist in the time. He just happened to be a man, and in that time, only male artists were deemed valuable. But there are plenty, if we revisit the canon of art history, I'm sure we could find plenty of underrepresented artists from then and from today. But even if we say that's too radical, you know, even if, although it is equally radical to show work by abusers, that's a radical thing to do. It's a radical thing to show work that's objectifying children. Like, even if you feel like you're not picking a side, you're picking a side by saying this is okay. It's equally as radical. But if it's too radical to take them down, then maybe it's on a plaque. You know, contextualizing the work, contextualizing the artist.
If you believe in the power, I so feel what you're saying, and I feel like if you believe in the power of images, if you really love art, you recognize how the conditions of that add meaning to it. If you don't believe in censorship and you believe putting everything on the table, why not characterize the artist as who they really are? Why not describe them in their actual relationship to women? And in your article about the Baltus painting, you say that to you it feels like more of a dream than a sexual depiction, and I almost feel like that borders on irresponsible, because I understand that maybe that, everyone has the right to their own interpretation of works, and I know that a lot of people connect it to surrealism, but I think that any woman looking at that piece of art is
a
going
ruse.
I don't find it to be shocking. I think it's actually very normal. The sexualization of children in art has a long history,
Well,
and I'm not shocked by
know,
that. And I'm
well-
not shocked by men defending other men who do that.
Well, I'm not going there, I'm not defending anything like that.
Right.
But what I am doing is defending him in particular because he lived to 93, 94. He was never accused of any inappropriate behavior
What year was this
whatsoever.
though?
And women know that just because someone wasn't accused, tried, or had action
Well,
taken against them,
in
that
90
doesn't mean it didn't happen.
In 93 years, there was nothing on the record whatsoever.
Also not shocking.
And in the context of his work, it's not like every work he did, his output was enormous, enormous. And, he was really more obsessed with cats, to be honest. But anyway.
But I agree with you too. I don't think there's a reason you can't re-examine. There's absolutely no reason. Again, today we live in a different time, and I think it's legitimate to take another look at those images and say, what purpose? What are these about?
Well,
What
you're
purpose
right.
do
No,
they
you're
serve?
right. You're right. And in the context of, talk about Picasso. In the context of Picasso, his biography and these things, new biography is going to come out, and for sure, the dark mark against him is going to be his abuse of women. But that's part of the history. You don't start taking down his works. It's just that it's a part of art history, okay? It's going to be, when you talk about Picasso, you're going to have to put it in context.
You might need a plaque.
Well, I hope it's education. I hope
Right.
it's education, and I think, certainly these things that may have been suppressed and so forth are not going to be suppressed anymore. And if something comes up on the record with regard to Baltus, then that's going to come up too. But, and it'll be part of art history. So I think a re-examination is due. With regard to the Me Too movement and Chuck Close and Woody Allen and that kind of thing, that's an open issue, and it's far from being resolved. There are a lot of, do you want to see a Woody Allen movie anymore?
Yes, of course.
Well,
It's not,
all right, well, why don't we
yeah.
turn it over to the audience?
Yeah.
Go ahead. You go ahead.
Even if the person is not a hero of morality, we still enjoy his art or his creations. It has nothing to do with personality. Do we listen to Wagner if we like it? Who is suffering? Wagner is not suffering.
Right.
Or Picasso.
Right.
Well,
So I think, the marketplace will correct for what they, how you view them. Some people will never see or listen to enough. Some people will never go to another Woody Allen movie. Other people will still do it. And some people with Michael Jackson, for example, some people will never listen to Michael Jackson music the same way anymore. So, the marketplace will correct itself with regard to these people. Maybe a Chuck Close will never sell again at auction. Sometimes auctions might not even accept his work eventually.
I believe that the position of the author matters. The position of the author changes meaning. If that Baltus painting had been made by a woman, it would be different, though a woman would never make that painting. But if a woman had, she would have a deeper connection to, exploring sexuality as a child and a woman. But this is the subject, this is the author's position as an older man looking at an unconscious child. That changes the meaning of that painting. I think that who the author is and their position to the subject does add to meaning and change
If
it.
it's good art, it's good art.
Now there's a slippery slope.
No.
But
Well, I grew
who's
up
to
with the-
decide? That's what is disturbing to me, because then you go back to degenerate art. I mean, why is this person gonna decide, I mean, it shouldn't be censored.
Because
I'm
museums
sorry.
serve publics, they don't serve governments. They serve the public. And if 500,000 people come up with a petition and they are members and, people who contribute to those museums,
Yeah, the
doesn't
problem,
matter.
What would you
the
do? So you
problem
would just
with-
remove the painting and not have never, ever have anyone see it again?
Absolutely
You're
not.
erasing
No, 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 no,
history.
no. I
You're
don't-
doing revisionism, and
I-
that is wrong.
I completely
That
agree
is
with you.
totally
I'm
wrong.
into the idea of saying more, right? I don't believe in burning paintings. I don't believe in censoring them. I believe in community engagement. I believe in expanded context. I believe in what we're doing here right now. That is how you address those issues. Do I think the Dana Schutz painting should be burned? Absolutely not. But do you think it's sufficient just to have a protester in the gallery and then to comment on it in interviews? If there's a dissenting party, invite them in. Allow them to speak their mind. It matters,
Who was stopping them speaking their mind?
Well, I think that they allowed protesters into the exhibition, but I don't know that those curators ever spoke with those dissenting parties in a public forum. They talked about it in interviews, which gave those curators the opportunity to only speak about it from their perspective, which I don't think does much.
I take a little more nuanced view. I don't think I've ever censored any piece of work ever, whether the curator chose it or whether I put a piece of. I think if you're going to do it, you need to be committed to that choice and then do something like this or have a narrative to explain
It's a
it. But
discussion.
I don't believe in censorship
I don't either.
at all.
Yeah.
So I don't want people to walk away and think, oh, he thinks,
Well, I thought we were talking about people taking this down, then that's censorship, isn't it?
I think that the
Taking what down?
conversation belies other issues. I think that if we only characterize these things as, attacks, then we're not actually getting at what these protesters are talking about, which is a lack of representation, which is a lack of inclusivity, which would change what we see.
Plus, that's in the public purview. So I don't think we're talking about this particular small panel. I think anytime you throw something out into the public view, you have to be prepared for a reaction. And it's sort of the institution's preparedness in dealing with that reaction. What are they doing? I don't believe in pulling the piece. You made that decision. You gotta live with it, as far as I'm
Yeah,
concerned. It should stay on the wall.
Once
But-
it's up, it's up, but I think you
Yeah.
have to have more curatorial responsibility about what goes up.
Yes.
Right.
well, that goes into self-censorship. There's a problem
I
there.
think it goes into editing, not into censorship.
Right,
I think there's a big difference between the two, and I see this in discussions a lot. I've run art galleries for decades, and I've done museum shows, and I've always tried to maintain a responsibility about where the space is and what's gonna be shown, and edit before it hits the walls.
Yep.
For the very reasons that you're talking about. It's refreshing to see an artist making this argument and not somebody else, because it's usually the opposite.
Yeah.
And I think that there is no single writer who has ever written a book of merit that was not edited by a professional editor. So I mean, when you talk about putting something out in the public, and you're talking about having to deal with the public's opinion about a work in a public space, not a commercial gallery like I run where I can do whatever the hell I want, but in a museum or a publicly funded exhibition hall, you have to have responsibility about being able to defend the work in the context of any attack that can come against it, and stand by it. And be like, this is the decision I made, if you're gonna fire me over it, I'll either survive it or I won't. But if you have to know before something hits a wall, what the reaction's gonna be.
Well,
Why are you
that's
selecting
what
that
the
work?
curators are there for.
Yeah,
That's
but I
what
mean,
they
it's-
do.
Right.
but that's a cop-out, right? I mean, you made two statements earlier. One was that you thought that the idea of art was that it had to disturb in some way. Absolutely not. That is such a new and bizarre notion that most of the great art
I'm
that
not
we look
saying
at.
that all art has to do that. I'm saying that often.
I don't think any of it has to. I think some does, and I think that that's the purpose of it. So you can create shocking art in
course
order
not
to
all art is
inspire
going to
a
do that.
reaction. But you're doing it to inspire a reaction. Her work features elements of what some people could call pornography, but that speaks about the valley. The porn industry is in the San Fernando Valley, so when the curators picked this piece of Valley Girl, this is an embrace of that entire thing. This is a very important part of that work. But they had to have known before they picked that work that that was in it. They had to make a decision that in spite of whether it's responsible to put that in an area that children are going to walk in front of, we've chosen it. And she rightly said in defense of her work, well, this isn't just these images. This was done in a really specific fashion that speaks to the work as a whole in chronological order, so I can't take it out. But I don't object because I would like it to be seen. And ostensibly, controversy makes the work, what? More valuable.
Yeah.
You made a statement also about the fact that you thought it made it less valuable. These plaques make these pieces worth way more money.
No,
artists-
I said the Danish Shoots piece, maybe she set a record because after that, it's Sotheby's or.
Well, you said that having a plaque in the show diminished the value of the work. You said that. I think
Well,
that it doesn't. I
it
think it breeds
diminishes-
interest where there was none.
What I meant by that is it diminishes the aesthetic value of the work. That's what I'm saying.
In the modern market, there is very little separation between aesthetic enjoyment and value. I think that they're now intertwined in a way that we are currently uncomfortable with, which is why we talk about Woody Allen, we talk about Roman Polanski. And it's like, these are things that aren't settled, as you said, rightly so, they're not settled yet. But there's evidence out there. But I mean, it's like, I think in the case of Woody Allen, he makes autobiographical veiled films. I mean, you're supporting his lifestyle by seeing his films. Whereas I think I and maybe most people that don't want to separate the art from the artists necessarily may say, I would rather see a person who is proven to be a terrible person make a work of great beauty that does not reflect their personal belief than to see someone who is excused because they're a great guy making a work that disenfranchises people of color or women or children. And I think that when you speak about Michael Jackson, it's like, yeah, I think I can enjoy Thriller, but I'll probably never listen to Pretty Young Thing again.
Okay. Somebody else? Who else?
Spread it around.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say that I was in New York for the Whitney Biennial, and I saw Danish Shoots painting in person. And I'm really glad that the curators did not pre-choose not to show the painting, because it might be controversial and might trigger some people about some things, because that painting was incredibly powerful. It was really moving. And I know a lot of people had some real tough times with it, and I may have even seen a couple of the people that were protesting. But what you don't get from a photograph is that that painting was made three-dimensionally. There was stuff coming out of it, stuff going into it. It's an amazing piece of work. And what I have to say about that is that because I saw that painting, it enabled me to have intelligent conversations with people of color about the painting and about my feelings towards it and their feelings towards it and how that painting was important in opening up these lines of dialogue between white people and people of color about Dana Shoots producing this artwork and whether or not she had the, quote, right to do it, to comment on a culture that was not her own. And it also made a lot of people aware of Emmett Till. Many people had not even heard of that situation before that painting became.
Yeah, there's no question that it
And
did
so
that.
I'm
It did that,
really-
and that was what she, and I'm no doubt that's what she intended. And
So I just wanna
she's
say,
been
please
interviewed
spare me
about it, and her
from
intentions
people who
were
are
good.
triggered by art and want to save me from seeing it. Because I'd rather
Right.
see it and experience it and be able to formulate my own ideas and converse with other people about it rather than having curators take it away from me before I have that chance.
Right. Anybody
Well
else?
said, very well said. Can I bring up something that Bill said, I think? Is that okay? He
What
said,
is
we
it?
were talking about the Chinese art, or any of you want to comment on it. And we were talking about, you know, and you brought up how, you know, it's a different culture, their relationship with animals are different and all that. And then one of the panelists said, I'm not sure, I thought it was Bill, but said something like, well, maybe, but this is for an American artist. Well, when I go see a Chinese contemporary show, I want to see something, I don't want it edited down for the American artist. I want to be exposed to that. That's what I want to see. We're doing Chinese contemporary art. Don't have them, murky the waters and oh, this is for the little sensitive American art, nation. We want to see what they're doing. I mean, how do we learn? How do you, if everything starts being censored?
Right.
Can I just say, I really take issue with this attitude of overly sensitive viewers or sort of disparaging being triggered by images. The image of the Emmett Till painting, whether you think it's powerful or not, is incredibly traumatic. I think that what I have a real issue with is how a lot of these articles surrounding these stories just really condescend to these activists. And if you believe in the power of art and you believe in the power of these images, you can understand why people are sensitive. It's not bad to be sensitive.
Well, but it's bad to censor art. That is what we're talking about.
But maybe the way we
It's
talk
very
about
bad.
it should.
I agree
Because
with
it's
you.
gonna go, it's not gonna stop. It's just
I
gonna get
agree with
worse.
you, but if somebody calls your institution and says, if you don't take that down, I'm gonna stick a bomb in your mail slot, you have a responsibility to react to that. And
Well,
it
I
if it-
understand
that's
that.
all I'm saying, to me, this adaptation of the work to the American, what's the point?
I think also
Why
this,
even bother to put it up if you're gonna strip out
Right.
the artist's intent? So I didn't agree with that.
I'm sure there's plenty of other contemporary Chinese artists that they could have also chosen. Like they're making
Right,
a curatorial
they
choice.
already made the choice.
Right, that's what I'm saying. It comes back
So-
to before the curatorial choice. I think once it's up, it shouldn't be censored.
Right.
It shouldn't be taken down. Nothing should be watered down for a certain
Right.
audience. I think that it comes to the curatorial choice beforehand. I think that they could. There's plenty of artists to choose from to put up. I'm sure there's other very very relevant contemporary Chinese artists who
Maybe
are
some more women.
yeah, who are really
There was a
doing
question,
things.
there's a question in the back.
I didn't
Yeah.
know who it was done by.
Well, I find it interesting coming from outside the art world and more the activist world, that the art world thinks that it's not already censored. You're in a highly unequal, racist,
Absolutely.
colonial society. You have a bunch, and this is taking off Leanne's point, and I find Stephen's unambiguous opposition to censorship just fetishizing. It's dishonest. It's obscuring the censorship that's already structured the art world. And if that's not acknowledged, then you're doing nothing but reinforcing
Yeah, no,
that system. And if you're starting to cite things like the First Amendment,
Yes.
I mean, that's an absolute joke. The First Amendment, freedom of speech, is a joke when the discourse is structured in advance by unequal education systems, unequal neighborhoods. I mean, you
I'm
can
very,
disagree on
I'm
it.
very much aware of that point of view. And the point is, obviously, art history has been skewed, just like American society has been skewed toward white males and so forth for years and years and years. So these things look, there are more women in art schools right now, but I mean, these things will be hopefully be corrected over time. In the meantime,
By the market.
well, partially by the market. We live in a capitalist society, so it looks like the market will correct
I
as
think
well.
that's a little
But,
naive.
but what's more important is that art history will be corrected. And the context, the context of what happened as a result of, these artists, their attitude toward minorities, toward women and so forth will be part of art history.
I just want to second what this young man said. When I came into the art world from the corporate sector, which is not, which is a different kettle of fish, I was shocked, completely shocked, as a person, one of the few running around, the art world, especially in San Francisco and then here, at the divisiveness and the prejudice and the imbalance in the art world. And I always tell people, it's the last battle. It's a cultural battle of epic proportions. And we're still not finished with it, but I completely agree with you. And we just need to keep doing what we can do best to change that balance.
I'd like to follow up with Bill, if I could interject here for a second. This may be a unique point of view, may not be, but I've been an artist most of my life. I do social political work, and I am under everyone's looking at it from every point of view, looking at what I do, what I'm trying to say. I've been censored 3 times in 3 different decades, from the late 80s to the 90s when the censorship thing was happening in its heyday, and up until just very recently too. And what I find really interesting is that nothing has changed. And it's not just a generalized umbrella of nothing, it's a very specific thing. The language has never changed. I've sat on so many panel discussions about censorship. I've been on them myself and defended myself. I've been in a court situation to defend myself. I've had the ACLU behind me and defending me, who is a godsend. No matter how you look at it, they are there for you. If you have a problem, call them up.
That's right.
They will respond to you, guaranteed.
That's
They are
right.
on your side. No questions asked. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because having been through it so many times, and including here today, and everyone's unique point of views, which are all valid and important in this discussion, but the language used has never changed over time. And it's not so much the fault of the language being used. It's because it's a hot, contentious topic that everyone from all different angles feel violated or insulted or in many other ways. The only thing I've seen as a subtle change in it, which has been brought up by most of our panel, is that education is key. And it's not so much educating them what your art's about. It's literally, what Bill mentions too, it's the duty, the responsibility, the accountability of a lot of the institutions, whether it be public, private galleries, whatnot, to know very well for certain what they are putting on the wall. And they know beforehand, they just don't want to deal with it, to have everything in place to start the dialogue before the show opens. And if it is a hot topic, and it's going to offend everyone, and yes, I don't believe anything is off topic. It should all be put out there. The reason it's being put out there and the reason it's being censored and discussed is because it's an issue. We just haven't come to terms with it. That's why there's arguments and battles.
It is an issue. It is an issue. It's a big issue, but yeah, there's a slippery slope, and eventually, if curators are self-censoring everything, then we'll just have pablum on the walls.
Can I break up the doom and gloom with a great example, actually? So there's this Samoan artist who came to my school. Her name is Yuki Kahara. She's amazing. And she made this piece called First Impressions, where she interviewed Samoan people about their impressions of Gauguin paintings, which are, colonial, objectifying, frankly, to me, disgusting. And it's in that video that she made is in a Gauguin exhibit at the De Young Museum. That is how curators answer those questions. Not even having an expanded wall text, but going to the community that's actually being talked about and having them reflect on what this art means to them, because their voices never get heard, certainly on the tiny island of Samoa. And actually, I just want to read this quote from a Dakota historian from the newspaper. She says, this is a great learning moment. And she says, they can speak with us and not about us. And that's what this is about. It's so much of the representation of marginalized communities has come from people who are not part of those communities. And if we want to see things, if we want to imagine a better world, I don't think that takes away from that Gauguin exhibit, So I think that's a great example of how curators can handle that type of issue.
It's just like the marketplace of ideas is out there.
It's so strange to me that there was censorship or some cultural pressures. I grew up in Soviet Union, where there was no real art displayed at all. There was nothing but communist propaganda. And when I came here and went to the museums, I saw so much interesting contemporary art, so diverse, that I could never imagine there was censorship.
I just wanted to really quickly piggyback off of what the guy back there was saying. Because we're talking, you mentioned this thing self-censorship a lot, and then the woman speaking about the Whitney painting also kind of mentioned that you would not feel as a viewer like it was okay for curators to preemptively censor the work. And I think that maybe that I'm not really representing what I'm saying well enough, because I'm not talking about self-censoring beforehand. I'm saying making an active choice to show something else, ideally from someone from a marginalized community, because you can argue the same fact that, are all of these people of color, women artists who aren't in shows, they're not being shown in galleries, they're not in MoMA, they're not anywhere. Are these people being censored? I'd argue yes. I'd say they're the most censored people.
That's a whole other issue, and it's actually a very big issue as to whether minorities have been censored but through discrimination.
I'd say it's
But that's actually a topic for the next lecture.
That's the second.
Because that will
part two.
Because that will be part two, and it'll be even more contentious.
This guy's had a question for so long.
Okay, yeah, this is the last question.
Yes, I have a question. So far, the panelists have covered a great deal, and I'm hearing a lot about the content of the artwork itself. But another aspect of it, and first I want to make a preface because I'm about to ask a question that's very controversial. First off, I'm Jewish, grandson of a Holocaust survivor, but I want to throw into the mix, just for the purpose of conversation, do we censor based on the reputation, maybe ideological or political views of an artist, either during the time that they created the work or, in some cases, past the time they created the work? Out of context, do we censor the artist? So, for example, Adolf Hitler, he had works that were a little bit on an impressionist kind of style. He created his works, and then he went into his political career and became the individual that he became. But as a Jew, I don't want to necessarily support his work or even necessarily put him on the canon of art itself. But he was an artist, and he did try in that field, and that was before his time that he became the monster, so to speak, that he's been characterized by history. Do we censor his work and not allow his work?
It's interesting that you bring it. Yeah.
Skukowski's, I apologize, I'm screwing up his pronunciation of his name, in recent Netflix documentary, his whole story is here's a man who became near famous in his time, but believed in nationalistic ideas and very much believed and promoted at his time in Poland of pushing the Jews out or even any minorities. Here's an artist that has kind of been stained by a past that he participated in. Do we censor his work?
Well,
so it's a question of not even just the content, but the reputation of an artist has as much of an impact on a community, and I'm kind of curious as to what a curator would say in respect of censorship.
A curator?
Well, I'd say no. I mean, I think context is everything. And I think as a curator, you have a responsibility to tell a story with the visual work. And every curator is going to look at it a little bit differently, but again, I think every story deserves to be told, whether you like it or not. And you may have an opposition to Hitler the monster, but that doesn't make the story any less compelling or educational to a younger generation, an older generation. I think it's an important story to tell.
Yeah, curiously enough, there's an article just posted I think it's Friday, in the New York Times regarding sales of Hitler's works of art. Turns out that 95% of them are fake, but they are legal for sale in Germany. they're also, they had some examples of them, and they're awful. I mean, again, it's a house, a lake, a tree, a bird, that level of art. That's why he wasn't accepted in art school in Vienna, and probably one of the reasons why he was a bitter person, but there you go. On top of that, but you know, a better example actually is the work of Richard Wagner, who was virulently anti-Semitic, but nonetheless, you know, one of the great composers of all time. But people are entitled to, you know, walk out of his concerts or never go if they feel that way. But I don't believe they would be should be censored. No.
I guess my question more specifically is just to elaborate briefly. We have a lot of views in our contemporary world where we look at artists like you guys were saying earlier, say Picasso's work, and you look at him as the person and not just the artwork itself, but you put that in context, and then you consider to revise history or the point of view of the artist. As you were saying, that history might be changed in the future, and I would have to kind of disagree a little bit with the point you made earlier, and I would kind of defend your view that yes, today's world will write books for the future and have a very different voice from those generations previous to us, and in that case, our history would be changed. But my question really, in terms of a censoring kind of view, is we look backwards and we see an artist that we once maybe revered, but now we have a closer look as to who he was behind the scenes, and now we have a different view of, oh, well, you know what, now we actually don't like Picasso. So does that mean we should take his work off the wall? That's kind of more of the point of view I was kind of trying to hone in on. Do we allow the view of the person to kind of inform or rather censor the art that is being produced?
So I would kind of piggyback off what she was saying about contextualizing the work, right? I don't think that we should take down Picasso. I kind of said that in jest, but I don't actually think that. But I do think it's important, you know, to maybe have, I don't know, I'm not a curator, but maybe have some piece of work next to it, a performance piece by a woman who was, the performance piece is about being abused by men or something. You can contextualize the work in a way that's not revising history, but that's adding, building on it, you know?
The Yuki Kahara is a perfect example.
Exactly.
Like, it's a perfect example to have. When has Gauguin ever been shown with the contextualization of the perspectives of Samoan people? Like, that is how you answer that question. No one, and in fact, I think this panel maybe would be a little bit more fair if we had someone here who was arguing for censorship, you know, but there is no one here who's arguing for censorship.
Yeah.
We're arguing for education and community engagement.
Last question.
No.
Well, what you're talking about, unless I'm misunderstanding, that is, I love these ideas, but that's not about censorship, that's about curators having some good ideas.
Yeah, right.
And what I find is going on right now in the art world is that curators are controlling and dictating what is going to be seen by the public. And that's a problem, that's a big problem, and nobody's talking about that. Everything is very one-sided, very politically oriented, very women-oriented, very me too, and there's no other side of that. And if I try to make some work that shows some other perspective, for whatever reason I want to do, it's not going to be seen. It's very clear. Because, and I've discussed this with some really, you know, art authorities, and it wouldn't be shown. It wouldn't be shown in this town. It wouldn't have a chance. Is that not censorship as well?
Hasn't that been shown for the past 700 years?
I wish, and I know your work, I wish I had a good answer for that. I think what I see happening in, you know, curators go through, there's a lot of trends going on, you know. First it's this person, that's a trend, and now we have a lot of African-American art out there. That seems, I think it's a good trend, you know, it hasn't happened in a while. And people jump on the bandwagon, and it's a very complicated market. And my best answer is you just have to keep at it and find the right venue and the right curator who resonates with what it is you're doing and get support that way. But it's not an easy road to hoe, sure.
And on that, we're gonna have to end it here. I want to thank the panel.
Join us if you want to continue the conversation.
The coffee fit.